Looking back now, exactly 1 year after what locals still call the Meadowbrook takedown, I can finally laugh about it. Who would have thought that moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood on a peaceful Sunday morning would turn into the most intense 16 hours of my life? My name is Jake Morrison, and this is the story of how I went from being a simple software engineer looking for a shorter commute to accidentally becoming the guy who exposed a multi-million-dollar real estate scam. All in one day. All because of a woman with wild blonde curls, a red HOA polo shirt, and an attitude that could stop traffic. Let me introduce you to the cast of characters who made this insane day possible. First, there's me, Jake Morrison, 32 years old, recently divorced software engineer who just wanted a quiet place to rebuild his life and maybe grow some tomatoes. Then we have Sarah Mitchell, the self-appointed queen of Meadowbrook Heights, a woman in her late 30s with a Napoleon complex and an inexplicable obsession with property violations. Picture someone who peaked in high school student government and never got over it, except now she had real power and zero accountability. Her signature look was that bright red HOA polo shirt stretched tight across her chest, white shorts that left nothing to the imagination, and a wild mane of blonde curls that seemed to expand with her rage. Rounding out our drama was Robert Miller, a 78-year-old retired teacher who became my unlikely ally, and Tom Williams, my college roommate turned real estate attorney who would prove to be Sarah's worst nightmare. The morning started innocently enough at exactly 6 a.m. on a beautiful September Sunday. The moving truck pulled up to my new house on Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial with a small front porch that I was already planning to enjoy with my morning coffee. I had specifically requested the early time slot because I wanted to get everything moved in before Monday morning rolled around and I had to start my new job. The neighborhood looked like something straight out of a 1950s postcard. Perfectly manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and the kind of peaceful suburban silence that costs extra in today's housing market. Little did I know that this picture-perfect facade was hiding something much darker underneath. I had just lifted the first box labeled Kitchen Essentials from the truck when she appeared like a suburban avenging angel. Sarah Mitchell came storming out of the house next door with the purposeful stride of someone who had been watching and waiting for this exact moment. Even at 6 in the morning, she was fully dressed in her HOA president uniform, her blonde curls bouncing with each aggressive step. The sight was almost comical. Here I was in my old jeans and paint-stained t-shirt, holding a box of coffee mugs, while she approached looking like she was heading to a very angry board meeting. "Hey, you there! What do you think you're doing?" She shouted across the quiet morning air, her voice cutting through the peaceful suburban silence like a fire alarm. I set down my box and looked around, genuinely wondering if she was talking to someone else. Maybe there was a raccoon in her garbage cans or something. "Excuse me, Mom? I'm just moving into my new house," I replied, gesturing toward the colonial that I had closed on just 3 days earlier. The paperwork was still fresh in my briefcase upstairs. At 6 in the morning? On a Sunday? She had reached my driveway now, hands planted firmly on her hips in the universal pose of suburban authority. Her eyes were already scanning my truck like she was conducting a military inspection. "That's a direct violation of Meadowbrook Heights HOA regulations, Section 4, Subsection 12. Moving activities are strictly prohibited before 9 a.m. and after 5 p.m. on weekends and holidays." The way she rattled off those numbers, you'd think she had the entire HOA handbook memorized, which, as I would later discover, she basically did. I blinked several times, trying to process what I was hearing. In all my years of apartment living, I had never encountered anything quite like this. "I'm sorry, but the moving company could only come this early because of their schedule. I didn't know there were rules about what time I could move into my own house." I tried to keep my voice friendly and reasonable, hoping this was just some kind of misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple explanation. Boy, was I wrong about that. Sarah pulled out what looked like a pre-printed citation form from her back pocket. "And seriously, who carries those around at 6 a.m. on a Sunday?" She started scribbling on it with the efficiency of someone who had done this many, many times before. "Ignorance of HOA regulations is not an excuse, Mr." She paused, pen hovering over the paper. "Morrison?" I supplied, still trying to be helpful despite the growing absurdity of the situation. "Mr. Morrison, this is your first official violation notice. The fine for unauthorized moving activities during restricted hours is $200, payable within 30 days. She thrust the yellow piece of paper into my hands with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved world hunger. I stared at it, feeling like I had accidentally stepped through a portal into some alternate dimension where moving into your own home was apparently a criminal offense. The citation was professionally printed, complete with case numbers, legal disclaimers, and a detailed payment schedule. This wasn't someone making up rules on the spot. This was an entire system designed to extract money from people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. "Now, I'll need you to move that truck to the designated temporary parking area," Sarah continued, consulting what appeared to be a laminated map of the neighborhood. "And all moving activities must cease immediately until 9 a.m., at which point you'll need to fill out a moving activity permit, available on our website for a processing fee of $50. She said all of this with the kind of bureaucratic cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. This woman was clearly enjoying herself way too much. The next few hours turned into a masterclass in creative harassment that would have impressed medieval inquisitors. Every single thing I did seemed to trigger another violation in Sarah's increasingly twisted interpretation of neighborhood law. When I moved the truck exactly 3 inches to the left to avoid blocking a storm drain, something any reasonable person would consider common courtesy, she reappeared with her citation book faster than a vampire responding to an invitation. "Unauthorized vehicle repositioning without proper notification," she announced, scribbling away with obvious delight. "That's another $300, plus a $50 administrative fee for requiring additional monitoring of your moving activities." I watched in amazement as she actually pulled out a measuring tape to document the exact distance the truck had moved. The level of petty obsession was almost artistic in its completeness. Around 9 a.m., when moving activities were supposedly permitted, things somehow got even worse. Sarah had apparently spent the morning consulting her violation handbook because she returned with a whole new arsenal of infractions. The moving men were walking too fast. Excessive foot traffic velocity, which was apparently dangerous to the neighborhood's pedestrian safety standards. When they set a box down on my lawn for 30 seconds to adjust their grip, that became unauthorized storage of personal property on common viewing areas. By noon, I was sitting on my own front porch eating a peanut butter sandwich and trying to make sense of the growing stack of yellow citation papers when Sarah made her most audacious move yet. She marched up my front walkway with the confidence of someone who owned not just the neighborhood, but possibly the entire county. "Violation of outdoor dining regulations," she announced, before I could even swallow my bite of sandwich. "Consumption of food in outdoor spaces requires proper permits and adherence to community aesthetic standards." Are you seriously telling me I can't eat lunch on my own front porch? I asked, genuinely incredulous now. The sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard, but I was too stunned to stop chewing. This is my house. This is my porch. These are my taste buds. I thought maybe humor would diffuse the situation, but Sarah was clearly immune to normal human emotions like amusement or basic empathy. Mr. Morrison, your property may be privately owned, but it exists within the visual and regulatory framework of our community, she replied with the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that would make a politician proud. Outdoor dining must comply with our aesthetic guidelines, including proper table settings, approved seating arrangements, and advance notification of meal times. The fine for this violation is $1,000 plus mandatory attendance at our next community standards workshop. That's when something inside me snapped. Not the angry, shouting kind of snap, the cold, calculating kind that happens when a software engineer realizes he's looking at a system that needs to be debugged. I set down my sandwich and really looked at Sarah for the first time. She was standing there in her ridiculous red polo shirt and white shorts, blonde curls practically vibrating with righteous indignation, holding that citation book like it was the Holy Grail. But her eyes told a different story. They weren't the eyes of someone enforcing rules for the good of the community. They were the eyes of someone who had found a way to make money off other people's misery, and was loving every minute of it. Sarah, I said, keeping my voice calm and level, can I ask you something? How long have you been HOA president? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She had probably expected me to argue about the sandwich violation, not start asking about her background. 3 years, she replied with obvious pride. 3 years of bringing order and standards to this community. I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was the most fascinating information I had heard all day. And how many families have moved away during that time? The question hit its mark. For just a second, Sarah's confident mask slipped, and I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt? Fear? Or maybe just annoyance that someone was asking the right questions. People move for all sorts of reasons, she said quickly, but her voice had lost some of its authority. Job changes, family situations, financial difficulties. It's not the HOA's responsibility to keep track of every individual's personal circumstances. That's when my neighbor, Robert Miller, shuffled over, moving slowly, but with obvious purpose. Robert was probably in his late 70s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent teaching high school mathematics to ungrateful teenagers. He had been watching the morning's events from his front window and apparently decided it was time to get involved. Son, he said quietly, glancing nervously at Sarah, you need to be very careful with this woman. She's not just power-hungry. She's dangerous in ways you can't imagine yet. Sarah's face immediately hardened. Mr. Miller, I don't recall inviting you into this conversation. Perhaps you should return to your house before you find yourself cited for interference with official HOA business. The threat was barely veiled, and Robert actually took a step backward. But he didn't leave. Instead, he looked directly at me and said something that changed everything. 5 families on this street have been forced to sell their homes in the past year because of her fines and legal harassment. And somehow she always seems to know exactly when those houses are going up for sale. The pieces clicked together in my mind, like lines of code finally compiling correctly. This wasn't about maintaining community standards or enforcing reasonable regulations. This was about money, power, and a very clever woman who had figured out how to use the HOA system to steal people's homes. Sarah wasn't just a bureaucratic nightmare. She was running a sophisticated real estate scam, and every citation she wrote was another step in a carefully orchestrated plan to drive people out of their houses so she could profit from their misery. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Miller," I said, keeping my voice neutral while my mind raced through the implications. "Are you saying that Sarah here has some kind of financial interest in driving people out of the neighborhood?" Robert nodded grimly. "More than financial interest, son. She's got a whole system worked out. Impossible fines, legal harassment, constant violations for things that aren't even real problems. She wears people down until selling seems like their only escape. And then her business partners always seem to have cash offers ready." Sarah's face had gone from confident to furious to something approaching panic. "These are completely baseless accusations from a bitter old man who refuses to maintain his property according to community standards." She snapped, but her voice was shaking now. "Mr. Miller has been a problem resident for years, constantly fighting reasonable regulations and spreading malicious gossip about the HOA board." But I noticed she wasn't actually denying the accusations. She was deflecting, attacking Robert's credibility instead of addressing the substance of what he was saying. Interesting. I mused aloud, pulling out my phone. "So if I were to, say, look up the property records for this neighborhood over the past few years, I wouldn't find any unusual patterns? No connections between the HOA and the buyers of these foreclosed properties?" Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what I was suggesting. "You can't. That information is private. You have no right to go digging into people's personal business." But of course, property records are public information, and she knew it as well as I did. I spent the next 3 hours conducting the most intense investigation of my life, and what I found was even more disturbing than I had imagined. While Sarah continued her rounds through the neighborhood, citing people for violations like excessive window reflectivity and non-conforming door handle finishes, I was systematically documenting her entire operation. Armed with my laptop, my phone, and a growing sense of righteous anger, I started mapping out the network of corruption that Sarah had built around herself. The pattern was sickeningly clear once you knew what to look for. Sarah didn't target houses randomly. She specifically went after vulnerable residents who would struggle to fight back legally. Elderly couples on fixed incomes, single parents already stretched thin financially, recent divorcees like myself who were dealing with major life changes. She had perfected a system of escalating harassment that would break down her victims over months or even years, layering on fines and violations until the constant stress and mounting legal bills made selling seem like the only way to escape. But the really diabolical part was what happened after people gave up and decided to sell. Somehow, Sarah's network of business partners always seemed to know exactly when a house was about to go on the market. They would swoop in with cash offers that were below market value, but attractive to desperate sellers who just wanted out. Then, after minimal renovations, those same houses would be flipped for massive profits or turned into rental properties managed by companies that, surprise, had financial connections to Sarah herself. I called my college roommate Tom Williams, who had become a successful real estate attorney specializing in exactly this kind of fraud. "Tom, I need you to drop everything and help me take down what I think is a massive HOA-based real estate scam," I said without preamble when he answered his phone. "And I need you to do it today, because I think I'm about to become this woman's next victim." Tom, bless him, didn't even hesitate. "Send me everything you've got, Jake. If this is what I think it is, we can shut her down completely. But we'll need to move fast before she realizes what we're doing. I also called my sister Lisa, whose husband worked in the FBI's white-collar crime division. Lisa, remember how you always said if I ever needed help with anything illegal I should call? Well, I need help with something illegal, but this time I'm the good guy. 20 minutes later, I was on a conference call with Special Agent Michael Rodriguez, who informed me that Sarah Mitchell had been on their radar for months as part of a larger investigation into HOA-based real estate fraud across multiple counties. Mr. Morrison, you've just become a very valuable asset in a federal investigation. Agent Rodriguez told me. We've been building a case against Ms. Mitchell and her associates, but we needed someone on the inside to provide fresh evidence and testimony. Are you willing to help us gather the documentation we need to shut down her entire operation? I looked out my window at Sarah, who was currently measuring the exact height of Robert Miller's garden gnome with what appeared to be a professional surveying tool, and smiled. Agent Rodriguez, it would be my absolute pleasure. And the final confrontation was scheduled for exactly 6 p.m., just as the sun was beginning to set over what had been the longest day of my life. Sarah had spent the afternoon gathering what she probably thought was an intimidating entourage. 3 other HOA board members who looked like they had been recruited from a community theater production of Angry Suburbanites, and someone she introduced as their legal counsel, though he looked more like someone who handled parking tickets than federal crimes. She marched up my driveway with her little army in tow, that wild blonde hair practically crackling with righteous indignation. Her red polo shirt had somehow gotten even tighter during the day, and her white shorts looked like they had been ironed for this special occasion. Mr. Morrison, she announced in her most official voice, clearly savoring what she thought was going to be her moment of triumph. You have accumulated over $2,000 in violations during your first day as a Meadowbrook Heights resident. This is a new neighborhood record, and frankly, it demonstrates a flagrant disregard for our community standards that cannot be tolerated. I had been waiting for this moment all day, and I was ready. $2,000? Wow, Sarah, that's impressive. Can I call you Sarah? I feel like we've really gotten to know each other today. I pulled out my phone and held it up so everyone could see the screen. Before we talk about those fines, I have something I think you'll find interesting. I recorded our conversation from this afternoon. You remember, the one where you were talking to someone about the new target and getting foreclosure paperwork ready as usual? I hit play, and Sarah's own voice filled the evening air with crystal clarity. Right, the new target has arrived. Get the foreclosure paperwork ready like we discussed. No, this time needs to be faster than usual. I need that lot cleared and ready for development within the month. The buyer is getting impatient, and we can't afford to lose this deal. The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop on the asphalt. The color drained from Sarah's face so quickly, I thought she might actually faint right there on my driveway. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Finally, she managed to sputter. You recorded me! That's completely illegal! You can't use private conversations as evidence! But her voice had lost all its authority, all its confidence. She sounded like what she really was, a criminal who had just been caught red-handed. Actually, Sarah, this is a one-party consent state, which means I can legally record any conversation I'm part of. I replied calmly, enjoying her growing panic. But you know what isn't legal? Using a homeowners association to commit systematic real estate fraud. Extortion. Conspiracy. and probably about a dozen other federal crimes that I'm not qualified to pronounce correctly. I held up a thick folder that I had been assembling all day. 23 families, Sarah. 23 families that you've driven out of their homes over the past 3 years through harassment, illegal fines, and systematic abuse of the HOA system. That's when Tom Williams stepped out from behind the moving truck, where he had been waiting with his briefcase and his best courtroom smile. Tom had driven down from the city as soon as I called, bringing with him an arsenal of legal documents that would make Sarah's head spin. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of courtroom experience. "I'm Thomas Williams, attorney representing Mr. Morrison and 17 other families affected by your fraudulent HOA practices. This is a court order issued this afternoon, freezing all current and future enforcement actions pending a complete investigation into your organization's financial activities and regulatory practices." Sarah's so-called legal counsel took one look at the official court documents and literally started backing away toward the street. I just handle their incorporation paperwork and basic compliance issues," he stammered, clearly realizing that he was way out of his depth. "I don't know anything about fraud or illegal activities. I think maybe I should call my own lawyer." One of the HOA board members, a nervous-looking woman in her 50s, was already pulling out her phone. "Sarah, you never told us about any of this. You said we were just enforcing normal community standards." But Sarah wasn't going down without a fight, even though her empire was crumbling around her in real time. "This is harassment. This is a coordinated attack on our community by people who refuse to respect our standards and regulations," she screamed, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. "You people can't just come into our neighborhood and destroy everything we've built here. I've dedicated 3 years of my life to making this community better, and this is the thanks I get." "Everything you've built?" I shot back, feeling months of other people's suppressed anger flowing through me. "You mean the systematic theft of people's homes? The abuse of legal processes to line your own pockets? The financial terrorism you've been conducting against your own neighbors?" I gestured toward Robert Miller, who was standing nearby with tears of relief in his eyes. "You've been terrorizing elderly people, Sarah. You've been driving families out of their homes so you could profit from their misery. That's not community building. That's organized crime with a suburban twist." The sound of sirens in the distance put an abrupt end to Sarah's protests and denials. Within minutes, 2 FBI agents were walking up my driveway, their badges gleaming in the porch light like symbols of justice finally arriving. The lead agent, a professional-looking woman in her 40s, approached Sarah with the kind of calm efficiency that spoke of years of arresting white-collar criminals. "Sarah Mitchell?" she asked, though it was clearly a formality since they had obviously been watching the entire confrontation. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, extortion under color of authority, violation of federal racketeering statutes, and about 6 other charges that my partner will explain to you on the way to the federal building," the agent continued, pulling out handcuffs with practiced ease. As they read Sarah her rights, she kept screaming about her rights, about how we couldn't do this to her, about how she was just enforcing legitimate neighborhood standards that everyone had agreed to follow. But her wild blonde curls couldn't hide the fear in her eyes anymore, and her red HOA polo shirt suddenly looked less like a uniform and more like a costume from a play that had just ended very badly. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood with her citation book and administrative tyranny was being led away in the back of a federal vehicle. And honestly, the sweet taste of justice was better than any welcome to the neighborhood casserole could have been. As the police cars disappeared into the growing darkness, my new neighbors began emerging from their houses like people stepping out after a long, devastating storm had finally passed. The relief was palpable. You could literally feel the tension leaving the air as people realized that their 3-year nightmare was finally over. Robert Miller walked over with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Son, I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "That woman has been the absolute nightmare of this neighborhood for 3 years. People were afraid to plant flowers or paint their shutters or even walk their dogs without worrying about getting cited for something. Other residents began gathering in small groups, sharing stories of harassment, impossible fines, and constant fear that I was just beginning to understand. It turned out that Sarah's reign of terror had been even more extensive and systematic than I had realized during my day of investigation. She had driven away young families who couldn't afford her escalating fines, elderly couples who were intimidated by her legal threats, and anyone else who had the audacity to question her authority or challenge her increasingly ridiculous interpretations of neighborhood regulations. One woman, Janet Rodriguez, told me about how Sarah had fined her $800 for hanging Christmas lights that were allegedly 3 inches too low, according to holiday decoration guidelines. A young couple, Mark and Lisa Chen, had been forced to sell their first home after accumulating over $4,000 in fines for violations like excessive lawn irrigation frequency and non-regulation mailbox positioning. Every story was the same: escalating harassment, impossible standards, and financial pressure that eventually forced people to choose between fighting an expensive legal battle or simply giving up and moving away. The aftermath moved with the kind of swift efficiency that only comes when federal agents have been building a case for months and finally get the evidence they need to make arrests. Within a week, Sarah's entire HOA operation had been dismantled by investigators who discovered evidence of fraud going back not 3 years, but 5 full years. She had stolen an estimated $4.7 million in property value through her various schemes, directly affecting 42 families across multiple neighborhoods in 3 different counties. Her network of business partners turned out to include corrupt property appraisers who would artificially lower home values for forced sales, predatory real estate investors who specialized in buying distressed properties below market value, and at least one county official who had been taking bribes to expedite foreclosure proceedings and expedite Sarah's fake violation cases through the legal system. The whole criminal enterprise came crashing down like a house of cards once federal investigators started pulling on the threads that I had helped them identify. Sarah Mitchell herself was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on charges including conspiracy, racketeering, mail fraud, and extortion. The judge specifically noted during sentencing that her abuse of the HOA system had caused immeasurable harm to families and communities, and that her crimes represented a particularly cruel form of neighborhood terrorism that strikes at the heart of the American dream of homeownership. Her assets, including multiple properties she had acquired through her fraudulent schemes, were seized and liquidated to provide restitution to her victims. Meanwhile, the families who had been forced to sell their homes were able to file claims against Sarah's seized assets, and many of them eventually got their houses back or received substantial financial settlements that helped them rebuild their lives. The new Homeowners Association that was formed to replace Sarah's corrupt organization was democratically elected, transparently operated, and focused on actually improving the neighborhood instead of terrorizing the people who lived there. 6 months after that crazy day, Maple Street was completely unrecognizable in the best possible way. Children played in yards without fear of citations for excessive recreational noise. People planted gardens, hung seasonal decorations, and painted their houses whatever colors made them happy without having to consult lawyers or worry about $1,000 fines for aesthetic violations. Robert Miller started a community garden in the empty lot where Sarah's house used to stand. The property had been seized as part of her criminal assets and eventually donated to the city for public use. And me? I finally got to enjoy my morning coffee on that front porch I had been planning to use since the day I bought the house, watching kids ride bikes and neighbors actually talking to each other like normal human beings instead of looking over their shoulders in constant fear. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, especially when you can do it in the exact spot where someone tried to destroy your life and steal your home. Looking back on that insane day, 16 hours that changed not just my life, but the lives of dozens of families, I learned something important about standing up to bullies, even when they wear official titles and carry legal paperwork that looks legitimate. Sarah Mitchell had built her criminal empire on fear, isolation, and the reasonable assumption that her victims would be too intimidated, too financially stressed, or too legally naive to fight back effectively against someone who appeared to have the law on her side. But the moment people started talking to each other, sharing information, and working together to document what was really happening, her whole operation collapsed faster than a software program with a fatal bug in its core code. Evil might be creative, persistent, and surprisingly well organized, but it's rarely as strong as a community that decides to stand up for itself and refuses to be divided and conquered by someone who profits from their fear and misery. These days, when new families move to Maple Street, we make sure to welcome them properly, with actual homemade casseroles, helpful information about the neighborhood, and the promise that they'll never have to face a corrupt official or neighborhood tyrant alone again. We've learned that the best defense against people who abuse power is a community that refuses to be isolated, intimidated, or silenced by those who would profit from our division and fear. And if you ever find yourself facing down a corrupt HOA president with a citation book, a bad attitude, and a criminal enterprise disguised as community standards enforcement, remember this story. Sometimes the person who looks most powerless, the new guy just trying to move into his house and start a peaceful life, might just be the one who has the skills, the connections, and the sheer stubborn determination to bring an entire criminal organization crashing down in a single day.